The topic of my unit that I planned and taught was American contributors. And in this unit, it was designed for a first grade classroom and it integrated social studies, reading, and writing within the instruction. So the standards that were addressed in this unit, there were various reading standards, writing standards, speaking and listening standards, and history standards. The reading standards that were focused on were a lot of reading with informational text and really being able to pull out meaningful information from the informational text. And the writing standards that were hit pretty heavily on were just being able to recount events and be able to tell details that maybe have been pulled from informational text, and being able to open that writing with an opening, add the details, and provide some sense of closure. The history standards mostly included being able to recount events of an individual's life and being able to talk about the history of a country. So this unit was designed with some essential questions in mind. The questions that were aimed to address were: what makes a person able to shape history? What is America like because of the contributors that we are learning about? And lastly, how does learning about a remarkable person help us learn more about history? So basically the goal of this unit was to teach students about those who have influenced our country, but not only that, but to go a little bit further and deepen their understanding about why those people are important, or what aspects about those people made them so important, and what made them able to shape the history of our country. And also, in addition to that, how does our country look different because of those people? So a pre-assessment was given to students at the start of the unit, and the pre-assessment on the front page had the 8 contributors' names listed that we focused on. So we focused on George Washington, Betsy Ross, Paul Revere, Sybil Ludington, Benjamin Franklin, Mary Catherine Goddard, Abraham Lincoln, and Harriet Tubman. So on the front side of our pre-assessment, it was the names of all 8 of those contributors, along with pictures of each contributor. Students were to match the name and draw a line to the picture that is correct for each contributor. And for students, we did this assessment by reading it out loud. So I read the names to the students, and students would follow along and draw a picture from the name to the picture that they thought was that person. And the second part of this assessment, there was a question on the back that said, what makes a person worth learning about? And I read this question to students as well, and students were to talk about, why do we learn about these people, or what makes this person important enough to be learning about or talking about in school? And with the first part of the assessment, where students were to match the contributor's name with a picture, most students were able to match George Washington with the correct picture of him. And then when it came to the other contributors, such as Betsy Ross, Paul Revere, Sybil Ludington, Benjamin Franklin, Mary Catherine Goddard, Abraham Lincoln, and Harriet Tubman, students were not as familiar with those names, with the exception of Abraham Lincoln, and most of the lines were just, it looked like they just randomly did it. Students had questions throughout the assessment. They were making comments saying, I've never heard of this person, I don't know what they look like, I don't know the answer. So it was evident to me as the instructor that students did not know a lot of this information going into the unit. A lot of these people they've never heard of, with the exceptions of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. On the second part of the assessment, asked the question, what makes a person worth learning about? Most students had the answers that had to pertain with they were a president of our country. Some students even wrote down George Washington as their answer. But for the most part, most students considered somebody to be worth learning about as somebody that was famous, somebody that was our president, or or they named one of the presidents that they knew. So it didn't show that they had a deep understanding about these contributions that the people did, or the fact that all of these American contributors had certain attributes that made them worth learning about for our country. So immediately after analyzing the pre-assessments, I knew exactly where to begin. I knew that students needed to first become familiar with who these contributors were. So they needed to match a name with the picture so they could understand what they were like, and they needed background on each of these contributors. So each day was spent on a different contributor. So 8 days of the unit were spent learning about the contributors. So students were introduced to a new contributor each day, and some supplementary tools that we used, we read biographies about them, where we would read the biography out loud, whole group, and on the carpet, students would have the same biography to share with a partner to follow along with the reading. And once we did that, we were able to discuss what were some important parts about this contributor, what did this contributor do for our country, in addition to talking about, so we know that, so for example, George Washington, we know that he was our first president. We know that he fought in the colonial army. But what does that tell us about who George Washington was, or what kind of contributor George Washington was? So as the unit went on, we built on a list of characteristics and attributes that our American contributors possessed. Some that were unique to one contributor, or that kind of were the same across the board for all the contributors. So some popular ones that students really went back to were that these contributors were brave. So, for example, with Paul Revere and Sybil Ludington, the fact that they rode on a horse for a long time to warn people about the redcoats or the British Army coming, that made them brave. They put their lives in danger. And other contributors such as Harriet Tubman with escaping slavery and helping others to escape slavery. Those actions that they took showed that they were brave. In addition to that, one of the attributes that students really focused on, and once they learned this attribute, they became really quick to make connections, was putting the needs of others before themselves, so being selfless. But for first graders, selfless or putting the needs of others before your own was a new concept to them. So they understood what it meant, but hearing that phrase or that word was new to them. So from the front end, we discussed what that meant, and we were to discuss what an example of that would be. So once students became comfortable with making that connection of what it meant to be selfless or what it meant to put the needs of others before your own, they were very quick to make that connection with a lot of the contributors. So they were able to tell me or tell their classmates what a contributor was like. And not only were they able to do that, but they were able to tell what evidence they had. Why do you think Harriet Tubman was brave? Why do you think Betsy Ross put the needs of others before their own? Why do you think Benjamin Franklin was hardworking? So students were able to make these claims and these inferences about what the contributors were like and use different evidence learned about these contributors to support that. So we took time to learn about each contributor. We spent a day on them, and the final 2 days of the unit were spent on the outcome. The outcome task had students create their own biography, so they got to choose a contributor in which they were partial to, which one they might have found the most interesting, or which one they liked the best. And the first day they brainstormed which contributor they wanted to write their biography about, and they filled out an organizer gathering their thoughts. So the organizer had the names of all the contributors at the top, and students were to circle the contributor of their choice. And on that organizer, it required students to write about what was the contributor like, what did the contributor do for our country, and just general information about the contributor. So as students were finishing these organizers, I was able to check them. We were able to conference about what made that contributor so important, what kinds of things the contributor did. And of course, as with any classroom, there were very differing needs and readiness levels of students, so different accommodations were made with the writing task to ensure that all students were able to create their biography and get their thoughts on paper and really represent their ideas in a way that they could show to other people and that they could explain who the contributor was and why the contributor was so important. And at the end, when students were creating their biographies, they also had the opportunity to share the biographies with the class. So this served as a way for students to really demonstrate the knowledge that they had built over the unit, as well as the students that were listening were able to learn about the contributors and learn about the different attributes that each contributor had. In addition to that, students were able to learn from each other's writing. So after a student would share their biography, we had a class discussion about what things stood out to you about their writing. So students were able to talk about the details they included and the support that they included about how they knew a contributor was a certain way. In addition to that, students were able to point out features of writing that they liked. They might have liked the way that students were able to provide lots of detail and it made it very clear. Maybe they just liked the pictures that were supporting the information, or they really noticed that the sentences were good. They used good transition words. They were able to use capital letters at the beginning of sentences. They used appropriate end punctuation. Just things like that that we were able to discuss as a class, and it just really demonstrated students' growth over the unit of their knowledge of the contributors, what made someone worth learning about, in addition to what kinds of things they were looking for in writing. So at the end of the unit, students were also post-assessed on the same skills that they were pre-assessed on. So they were given the same pictures of all 8 contributors along with the names of all 8 contributors, and they were to match the contributors' names with the pictures. And students were able to do this much more accurately than they were the first time. Students were able to match the names of contributors to their pictures that they weren't familiar with at the beginning of the unit. And the second part of the assessment, which was asking about what makes somebody worth learning about or what makes somebody important enough to learn about in class, was also asked on this assessment. So going into this unit, that's where students were more answering the question of, oh, they're more important because they were the president, or they're worth learning about because they're George Washington. Answers that weren't really showing or representing deep understanding about what makes somebody able to shape our country or what makes somebody important. So answers by the end of the unit were more reflective of deeper understanding. So they worked hard, they changed our country, they just talking about the attributes that they possess. So they're hardworking, they never gave up, they were brave, they put the needs of others before themselves, they were helpful, they helped out a lot of people. Answers kind of along those lines for the most part that really represented that students understood what made contributors so important and why we even study them. So by the end of the unit, it was really great to be able to see the progress that students made and just their overall understanding and their excitement about American contributors and about our history. So that's my unit about American contributors.